Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to another webinar of the Environmental Data Initiative. For those of you not familiar with EDI, which is the acronym for Environmental Data Initiative, we are a NSF-funded project helping to accelerate the curation and archive of environmental data. And we operate and maintain a reliable, registered, and certified trustworthy data repository for ecological research data. We also provide training on the data archiving process, as well as data management best practices. And in this is also the theme of today's presentation, which is the fourth webinar in a series on the 5 phases of data publishing, which we are currently hosting. Today's topic is what are metadata and structured metadata, and the speakers are Kristin Vanderbilt and Margaret O'Brien, both information managers for EDI, but also information managers, in Kristin's case, for the Florida Coastal Everglades LTER, and in Margaret's case, for the Santa Barbara Coastal LTER. And so with this introduction, I hand over the mic to Kristin, and Kristin first and Margaret second.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne. Okay, I am sharing my screen. Okay. All right, can everybody see the word metadata?
Yep, I see it.
Okay, great. All right, hi everyone. My talk today is an overview of metadata. And, oh, hang on a sec. And I will be discussing what metadata are and talking about why the structure of metadata is important. And I'll also mention the value of metadata to both data creators, their organization, as well as data reusers. And finally, I'll offer a few tips for creating quality metadata. So suppose for a moment that you are a herpetologist and you want to do, say, a meta-analysis of a bunch of amphibian species. And so you reach out to your colleagues and ask them for some data sets. And one of your colleagues sends you this table. So what else might you want to know about this data set in order to be able to determine if you can use it or not? Well, one thing that might jump out at you right away is this. There are no units here. We have an average temperature, but we don't know if it's Celsius or Fahrenheit. We also don't know what this is the average temperature of. Is it the temperature of the skin of the frogs? Is it the temperature of the water in which the frog is found? Or when were these observations taken? Were they taken in the middle of the day, perhaps in the evening? That probably makes a difference to the temperature. And there is quite a disparity in the number of observations here in this column, the number of observations. There's 1 for the northern red-legged frog, whereas there are 897 for the wood frog. You might wonder why that is. And so those are the kinds of things that you would need to know in order to be able to determine if you could perhaps use this data set. And so that's what metadata are. They're data about data. They're information about who created the data, in case you need to contact them to get some clarification. What is the content of the data? What do those observations really mean? When were the data created? Were they collected, say, 10 years ago? Were they collected a month ago? That might be important for you to know in case something has happened to, say, frog populations in the last 10 years. Were these data collected in a zoo? Were they collected out in the wild where the animal lives naturally? And why were these temperatures collected? There might be some bias introduced because of the way or because of the reason the data were collected that would make these data unsuitable for your study. So those are the kinds of bits of information that go into metadata, and they allow a secondary data user to understand the data set and determine if it's appropriate. If you were here last week, you heard Suzanne give a very nice introduction to the EDI metadata template. If someone approaches us at EDI and wants to store their data with us, we share with them this Word EDI metadata template and ask them to fill it out. I won't go through it in nearly the detail she did, but we do ask for the dataset title. It needs to be quite descriptive. Let's see, I should probably have my pointer here. Okay, an abstract, and the investigators, who's involved with this data and gets their email address in case contact is needed. Other personnel, names and roles. Was there someone in a lab? Were there technicians involved in the field? Might want to include that information here. We also ask that the data creator choose keywords, and we suggest that they use a thesaurus or a controlled vocabulary to do this because keywords are so important. And we suggest the LTR vocabulary here. Okay. And on the second page of this Word template, we request information about the funding for this project because funders like to be able to find out what data products and other products were produced from the funding that they supplied. We ask for information about the time frame, where the data were collected. If there's a particular taxonomic group, we ask for that information. For methods, we ask for very specific information so that someone could perhaps reproduce the study if they wanted to. And then finally, we come down here to the data table. And here you have to describe what each of the columns in the data table represent. So, for instance, for each of the items, each of the column names in the data set, we ask for the name, of course. We ask for a description that can be quite long if it needs to be. If that column represents, say, whether or not the plot is A, B, or C, then that code would be explained here under unit or code explanation. Or if it's a numeric variable, we ask for the unit. And then there's an empty value code also in case there are empty cells in your data set. So this would look like for our frog data, the first column was species, it's common name of the frog. The second column was average temperature. So I've got the description, we've got the unit, and we've got the empty value code. So we get all this information, it's in a Word document. But then in order to make it really useful for data discovery and for data reuse, computers must be able to extract information from these metadata. That means that the metadata must be standardized. And I'll talk about standardizing with respect to content and also structure. Sorry. These are two metadata documents, and they both describe the same data set. But here on the left, we see that someone named Evelyn Geyser is somehow associated with this data set, whereas here on the right, we have more information. It was collected by Evelyn Geyser. Here, the title is short. Here, the title is longer and indicates the time period over which the study was done. There's more content in this metadata document than there is in this one. And neither one of these is particularly structured. So this is a different content and different structure. And we can standardize the content by just including the same information in both. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the same format. Here, whereas the period of the study is in the title, it is in these separate elements here. Okay, and the originator is specified in both cases. But these are still not standardized with respect to the structure. And here we have standardized the structure of the metadata by including tags within the document which indicate what the content is. A document marked up like this is easy for a computer to parse. So ultimately, the metadata that comes to us in a Word document is turned into a structure like this and then parsed into our database. And that makes it easy for computers then later to extract information and to use it. All right. So there are several different metadata standards based upon which discipline one is in. And in our case, at the EDI, we use the Ecological Metadata Language, EML standard. And this standard was developed by ecologists for ecologists. It's based on a lot of work that was done in the 90s by the Ecological Society of America. It's used for documenting ecological and environmental data sets. And it is implemented in XML. And in the most rudimentary sense, those are those tags that surround content that describe what it means. Excuse me, a better definition is a markup language. XML is a markup language that defines rules for encoding documents in a format that is machine readable. Now, Margaret's going to give you some more specifics about EML and more the technical piece. All right, so the metadata turns into EML and then we put it into the repository. What does the metadata record look like once it's in the repository? This is an example, and it is an example data set from the FCE LTER. the title is Periphyton Productivity from the Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough, Everglades, 2001 to the present. Okay. We see that there are the creators are listed, the publication date, and importantly, here is the citation. This citation includes a DOI, a permanent persistent identifier. And so this citation can actually be used in the same way that a citation for an article is used. So with references cited, then a scientist who reuses this data set would include this citation, and that will allow Evelyn, who put a lot of time into this data set, collecting the data and also archiving it, curating it, creating metadata and so on. She'll get credit for doing that. And so we really hope that people are using this citation, which is generated automatically when the metadata goes into the repository. Also in this data package summary are the abstract, some information about the spatial coverage. And later in the metadata record, one finds the keywords that were chosen. They were chosen from the LTR keyword thesaurus with a few site-specific ones thrown in, FCE, Florida Coastal Everglades, etc. And then there's information about the methods and protocols. Here, there is reference to this article from which the analytical protocol came from. All right, and finally, we get to the dataset attributes. Okay, you'll recall that for each attribute, we asked for the name of the attribute, the definition, and then there's some other information here that we are able to extract based upon what the scientist puts into that document. If there's a numeric variable, or actually for any variable, a missing code value can be specified. So each of these columns then represents one of the variables in the data set. And I'm talking about the Periphyton data set, not the frog one. So for the first line here, we have the column names as they show up in that data file: project, group, transect, substrate, date, net respiration, and so forth. The second line is the definition of each of these. So group is the name of the sampling group. Substrate is the periphytometer used, and so forth. Let's look a little more carefully at a couple of these attributes. This is the transect attribute. It's the transect where the observations were collected. And so the definition is location along freshwater saline gradient. It's a nominal variable. It's the same thing as saying it's a categorical variable. So in this column in the data set, you find either SRS, which is for Shark River Slough, or TS for Taylor Slough. So these categories are something that were defined in that Word document and then translated into EML. Okay. And another variable, this one is a numeric variable, net carbon production. And because it is a measurement, it has a unit, which is spelled out here, so it's unambiguous. It's given the precision and the code if there is a missing value. And we also have a date variable here, and the format of that date is indicated. In this case, year, dash, month, dash, day. Okay, so that's an awful lot of detail about this data table. And that seems like probably a fairly onerous task, particularly if we have 50 variables to put together. And it is a lot of work, but it's really useful. Why is all this detail necessary? Because by including it, it becomes possible for code to be written on the fly that can be used to analyze this data set. So let's go back here to this summary page about this data set. And here at the bottom is this option for code generation. It says analyze this data package using MATLAB, R, SAS, or SPSS. I'll choose R. And on the fly is written this program which allows one to pull the data directly out of the repository and do some simple analyses on it. This is pretty neat. And instead of having to download the data set, put it on your computer, link to it, this little statement here allows you to pull it directly out of the repository. And then the data frame is created, and down here the code is determining what is a factor and what is not. And then further down you can see some analyses that one can do. So this is pretty cool, I think. And that's one good thing that comes out of all the work that goes into creating those attribute metadata. All right. So I think you probably all have a pretty good sense of why metadata are important from the data reuser's perspective, but there are other reasons. And I wanted to show you this particular figure because it's a very famous figure, and no metadata talk is complete without it. Metadata are valuable because they help prevent what's called information entropy. What this means is that at the time of the data set development, scientists know most about their data set and the steps that were taken to create it, but through time, specific details are lost and general details. And circumstances may cause, you know, the data to be completely lost, or the metadata or the information that would have allowed one to create the metadata to be lost. And so without metadata, then information entropy can cause a complete loss of information about a data set, rendering it unusable. Now, structured data, what are they good for? All right, well, you've already seen that once the metadata is in the computer, it can be displayed in different ways. Here's the metadata being displayed on the FCE-LTER's website. And that same structured metadata can be put into the EDI data repository, where there are more opportunities for discovery and access because it's in a catalog with a lot of other data sets. And that same structured metadata can be harvested by Data1, which is a metadata aggregator, and put into its giant metadata catalog. Data1 is an entity that harvests metadata from 44 repositories and then collects them into this one large data catalog. And that is possible, again, because this EML allows exchange of metadata in that way. So structured metadata are pretty useful. All right. Okay, so metadata are pretty valuable to a data reuser, a secondary user, because it helps them find the data, it helps them understand the data and determine if they can use it. Is it also useful to the data creator, or is this all just an altruistic activity on the side of the data creator? Well, metadata is quite useful to the data creator as well, because it allows the data developer to preserve their own investment in a research project, so they don't lose those general details and specific details in case they want to reuse the data at some point, or use it for a purpose that wasn't, you know, originally intended for. It also allows the scientists to publicize their efforts by putting those metadata and data into a repository. They can get citations and maybe find some partners to do research with. It can be quite valuable to them as well. And for the organizations for which these researchers work, metadata also transcend people and time. It offers data permanence and creates an institutional memory. And two, it can advertise an organization's research in the same way by going into a repository. All right, I have a few tips for writing quality metadata, and one is that titles are really important. Titles are critical in helping readers assess if the data set is going to be useful to them. So when individuals are searching for the most appropriate data sets to use, they're most likely to use the titles to determine if the data set is going to meet their needs. And so a complete title should include what, where, and when, and who, also if it is relevant. So quick quiz here. Which title is better, Periphyton or Periphyton abundance data collected by FCE-LTR from Northeast Shark Slough, Florida Everglades National Park, September 2006 to September 2008? Well, it's obvious that the second one has a lot more information in it. It includes a what, a who, a where, and a when. Okay. So just a further note on this topic, what can happen if people don't come up with good titles. This is the Data1 search interface. And again, it's data from 44 repositories. And so I have searched here on plant phenology. And the results show me that there are these 3 data sets from the LTR repository. And I can look at these titles: 8 Mile Lake Research Watershed, Carbon and Permafrost Experiment, Plant Species Flowering Data, or Berry Production, or Bud Burst and Senescence. These are all good phenology data sets. Down here, on the other hand, are 2 data sets, one of which has the title of plant responses, and another one is abiotics. And there's something like, I think, 900 results from this query. I'm not likely to spend much time looking into data sets like this. So the message is, if you really want your data sets to possibly be found and reused, it's a good idea to make good titles. Another tip is to select your keywords wisely. Keywords are essential for locating records and catalogs quickly and easily. And so think about the many ways that someone might search for your data, and then based on those considerations, choose your keywords. We also suggest using a thesaurus or controlled vocabulary, because this will make your metadata more discoverable, understandable, and interoperable if you use a standard rather than just making up the keywords that seem best. So a bit about a thesaurus. A thesaurus is a restricted list of words or terms from which you select your keywords. It has a hierarchical structure, meaning that it has broader than terms, narrower than terms, in addition to related terms. It also can tell you preferred terms, if there are different ways to express something. And it is used because it's helpful to organize, categorize, and index information ultimately to assist with data discovery and retrieval. All right, so the thesaurus that we point people towards is the LTR thesaurus, and it's at this URL here. And I'll just show you how you can browse this. The LTR controlled vocabulary has 10 of these most general categories. And suppose I'm interested in dry deposition. It's an atmospheric process, and I'd like to find out if it's in this controlled vocabulary or what I should use instead for dry deposition. So I know this is a process, so I will look into this tree. And the narrower terms from process are, biological processes, physiological processes, or here, physical processes. That's where I will go. Narrower there are for physical processes, warming, burning, etc., and atmospheric processes. Okay, narrower term here is deposition, and then narrower still is bulk deposition. So that is a term that I could use and reference that it came from this standard. Okay, this is not the easiest way to use the LTR controlled vocabulary. Instead, there is a search up here, just put in bulk deposition in this case, and I can see where it was, where it's nested, okay? All right, I mentioned that the thesaurus will also tell you preferred terms. So here I've searched for NPP, net primary production, which is a commonly measured ecological parameter. Put that in, and I find here that that is not the preferred way to enter it into list of keywords. Instead, I should use spelled out net primary production, okay? Okay. Now, a gazetteer is kind of like a controlled vocabulary of place names. And so you can get standards, the standard way that a place is normally written. And I work a lot with data in Florida and in the Everglades in particular. And so there are lots of different ways that people send me the site name Everglades Wildlife Management Area, Conservation Area 3A. As you can probably imagine, there are lots of ways, lots of permutations of that. So I go here and I find out what the standard reference is to that name, and I use that. And this is the Geographic Names Information System, and it's operated by USGS. There's another thesaurus, commonly used, the Getty Thesaurus of Geographic Names. Okay. So I'll leave you with these few thoughts about the importance of metadata and the fact that metadata completes a data set. And I hope Margaret has now joined us. She was having some computer difficulties earlier. So I will stop sharing. Is Margaret here?
Yeah, Margaret's here.
Yeah, I made it. Sorry, somehow I had a major battle with my computer at about 1:45. I don't know. Okay, I'm sharing this talk, I believe.
Let's see.
Over
It looks
here,
like it's coming up. Yeah, I see your Google Drive.
You see the
Why use metadata standard? A metadata standard.
but you're seeing a slideshow, yeah?
It's not full. It's not in presenter mode yet.
Okay, it's going to go right to the top. Okay, and let's see. Where's the little doohickey? Pointer. There it is. Okay.
Okay. I don't think we're seeing the screen that perhaps you're looking to share.
You're looking at one that says structured metadata at EDI?
Structured metadata EDI is the tab. You're not in full screen though. You're not in presenter mode, and I don't see the little doohickey, the laser pointer yet.
What do you see?
I see a web browser with 4 tabs.
4 tabs. Oh, I'm present. Okay, let me get out of here. I think I'm presenting. Yeah. So let's see. When I go to present. So now you see the screen that has the slides in it.
Yes. Are you in full screen?
I'm not in full screen.
We don't see your mouse moving at all. It sounds like you're trying to move your mouse, but
yes,
we're on a static
full screen. Okay, so there I'm in full screen, and I can click. If I click the present, it says loading.
I think maybe we're not being you're not sharing the correct screen. So maybe back out of the screen share and then try it again.
All right, let me stop. Get my I can't find my Chrome. There it is. Oh. All right, let me try this again.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to share this one. Share screen.
Okay, let's see what happens.
So now are you seeing?
Okay, it looks like your mouse is live. We see that moving around now, and
you see. Oh, I saw something. Okay, and if I go to present.
Okay, looks like we're on the right track.
Now we're okay. Okay, it still says loading.
Yeah.
All right, let me grab the pointer. And I don't know why. Okay. I think I'm good now. All right. Sorry for all the drama. It's the way it goes sometimes. Okay, so yes, Kristin's given you an introduction of the general features of metadata, and I'm going to go into a little more detail about how EDA structures and uses that metadata. And this is in a community standard called Ecological Metadata Language, or EML. Now, the first question, which I think Kristin already answered, is why are we using a metadata standard? And we use the term standard here to mean a set of practices or tools that are established by our community. And of course, there are other ways to use this word, and you're all familiar with things like major international standards like ISO date format. But having this standard practice can facilitate consistent communication within a community because it provides these predictable common terms and definitions, plus the structure to help locate the components that you need. So, is it gonna go? Whoops. Okay, so I'm going to use a couple of other terms here as we get started. First is the word schema, which probably some of you have heard. At a high level, a schema is simply a diagram or an outline or a model. Both relational databases and XML use this term to describe their designs. And a metadata schema then is a set of features that's designed for a specific purpose, such as describing a type of data resource. A specification is a statement of precise requirements, so it's a way of describing the schema and its features in a particular language. It's similar to the way a blueprint would translate an architect's concepts into the language for how to actually create a building. So the blueprint will call out some of the features very precisely and some more generally. And for our metadata spec, because it's a computer spec, these features are probably going to be things like the typing of particular elements and the order that they appear. And metadata standards then are designed based on the needs of particular communities, the types of material that they want to describe, or the subject domains or specific project needs. For metadata standards, which are expected to be used for scientific data, virtually all of them include a description of what the item is and who to contact for more information. This is kind of like your title and your author, the way in Kristin's examples. And then some have more detailed information about location, things like location and dates and times. There are quite a few metadata standards out there, which have been in use for quite a while. Some of you might be familiar with Darwin Core, which is used for organism occurrences commonly. And then there's the geospatial ISO 19115, which is used for geospatial data. But even within the same subject domains or for the same type of resource, there may be 2 or more options for metadata standards. We're also going to talk about XML, which is a extensible markup language. It's a general purpose self-documenting mechanism for describing hierarchical data. So whenever you, I think, as Kristin illustrated, whenever there's this need to store complex data, whether it's for passing between systems or simply storing in a file, you've got to structure it somehow. And when it's read, then a program can figure out the beginning and the ends of records and what records are contained within other records. Some general features of XML, it's a little bit verbose. If you've looked at it, you'll see that it's one of its features. So the files can actually be somewhat large. They take more storage compared to simple text like JSON. So XML is not necessarily a great choice for cell phones or PDAs. But generally, computer storage is relatively inexpensive, and it's an advantage to have data well described. So XML alone does not have really strong typing. For example, it has strings and numbers and dates, or access control to the file itself. So the system in pulling it has to take care of those. The schema language requires some training. And manual editing can be a little bit tedious. But the strict syntax has very little ambiguity, and it allows for simple parsing routines. So XML has become the most common exchange format for web services. Its hierarchical and self-documenting nature means that programmatic access is relatively easy. XML is platform independent, so both humans and machines can read it, and the editing tools are improving. So its primary purpose is to facilitate the sharing of data across different systems, particularly those connected through the internet. And it's perfect for designing special purpose markup. So in 2003, LTER partnered with in the development of this metadata standard, called EML, and this is also used by EDI, and which we use for publishing and sharing data. So here's a few XML basics for you. You've probably heard the term XML schema language. This is basically how you describe the structure of an XML document. It's also referred to as XML schema definition and abbreviated as XSD. So it's a recommendation of the World Wide Web Consortium, the same way that HTML is a recommendation for web page content. So it formally describes the elements in an XML document. And the schema is used to verify each piece of content in that document. So XML is kind of like a language, and EML then is a dialect. And it fits together because a community then can write up its specification for the standard using schema language. Usually when you find a schema doc, it will have the extension XSD. And itself, it's also an XML document itself. If you're looking at an XML document in an editor, you would see something like this at the very top of the page. You would see this, this is example, whoops, my mouse is caught, 1 second there. This is an example at the top of an LTER metadata record as it appears in an XML editor called Oxygen, which is free, by the way, if you ever want to start looking at your documents. You may want to do that because at some point you might want to customize something to, or you just might like to play in XML. And of course, we guide you through that. So this right now is just an introduction because some of these are features that you might want to be aware of. On the left are some general terms that you run into if you look at XML editors. The first one is this word prologue. That refers to this line up here, which is the first line of any XML record. Excuse me. It has to be on line 1, and it has to be the first thing on line 1. The next line would be called the root element. Every XML document has one of these, and it defines what kind of a document file it will be. If this was an HTML web page, that element here, this would say HTML. And since this is an EML record, then it's going to have EML for the root. Well, the rest of this is also part of the root element. And we'll get to that in a minute. But one more thing, I've used the word validate here. Most XML editors have a capacity to actually compare your XML document to the schema that it's written against and tell you if it actually fits the rules. And so this is a term you will run into with editors quite a bit. On the right over here are the main components of an XML document. Basically, XML is made up of elements and attributes. Element content contain text or other elements, so that's how you get the hierarchical document. An attribute, an XML attribute, contains only text. Two other terms that you'll run into, but not much, are this term called namespace, and namespaces add complexity, and they're a way to break up your schema into modules, basically. And the reason that I mentioned it here is that you will occasionally run into them, and this right here, this part of the root element in front of the colon, EML colon, that's the namespace. So you may see that now and then. This is also a namespace that refers to the XML language itself. And the last feature is this schema location, the name of the schema and the schema location here in the very last part of the root element. And that's what the validator will use in order to validate your document. So this is saying that this belongs to this schema, and here's how you find the schema in order to run a validation. So EML was built on existing schemas, mainly for XML. Mainly it was FGDC and STMML, plus work by ESA. And Kristin gave you a history of that already. Some existing markup languages at that time were not completely adequate as is, or they were really generally tailored to spatial data instead of the kind of data that's more common in ecology. So EML contains many more descriptors and structures for data that's typically arranged in tables, and it's particularly good at these detailed descriptions of the kind of long-tail data that's so common in ecology. Kristin talked about the features that are available for EML, so I won't go into those. The code generators, and there's document parsers, and even a database loader. There's currently at least 90,000 EML records out in the wild, and that's only from the US. I don't actually know the total from the international contributors. EML is maintained by a volunteer group of ecologists and information scientists, and it's sponsored by NCS, the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. That's at UCSB. And you can find all the EML materials on GitHub.
Margaret, it looks
Yes.
like Ian may have a question here.
Oh,
Ian?
Sure. Go ahead, Ian. I can't see people. Oh, yes, I can.
It looks like the raise hand feature works. Very cool. I was just wondering, what do you mean DB loader?
Oh, there is a library of code for actually taking a data table described in EML and loading it into a relational database. I'm trying to think of the exact name for it off the top of my head. And it's not coming to me, but I'll find it for you. It's actually really interesting, and we use it at EDI. I think I've used it a few times in the past to load EML described data into Postgres, and we use it in order to validate at EDI to validate the data object against its metadata. We use a Postgres database as the kind of holding and typing device. We've learned quite a bit from working with it that way. Does that answer your question for now, or we can talk about this later, further?
Yes, that's great. But I would love to know the name when you get it. Remember?
Yeah, I'll remember it. I just haven't used it in a while, and I can't remember exactly what it is. But I'm fairly sure it's in the EML Git repository, which there's a link to that here, which you can probably find before I get to that slide. It's NCs and EML is pretty much all you need. I'm going to talk a little bit about EML anatomy. Because it's hierarchical, then you think of it as a tree, the metadata about a data set. So on the left, excuse me, on the left is a list of the elements in that tree. There's the larger sized are the 3 major sections, the access rules, which controls how who's allowed to edit this document, and then at the very bottom you see one called other metadata. The main part of interest to a data set is that big chunk in the middle where the data set metadata actually reside. The access rules and the other metadata can be thought of as supporting information. So that's those are all the major elements in an EML record. And then you see them here. This is a tree on the right is a tree of an example record in an editor, but I've collapsed all the subtrees so they're not, so you can see all the high level ones. And then this next, what I took here is this is the template that Suzanne showed you last week and that Kristin was talking about, and you can see that each of the terms that you put into this template actually maps to something in the EML. And this is another example of a transformed XML table. I was not going to go into a lot of detail on the table level EML. I can do that, but that gets into the weeds pretty fast. But if some of you are interested in that level, we can skip down to another set of slides that I have at the end of this and talk about that. But for the most part, what I really wanted to do was show you what all this structure gets you, which actually Kristin has already done. So this is great. This is just a kind of a reminder that the data tables themselves have a very rich set of descriptors. You can see this particular data set has lots of date fields, many string fields, fields that have units, which I let those kind of fall off the bottom of the view, so you're not seeing the units themselves. But all of this material is stored in the data table tree of the XML, of the EML record. So we can go into that detail if you like. If not, I think I can leave you with some really general links. If you want to see the example that I just used, there's a link to it right at the top. There are some EML best practice recommendations that were originally developed by the LTER Information Managers Committee, which EDI now maintains. There's a link there to the EML project itself, and then the repository on Git. You can find links to all these things at the EDI website under resources and the 5 phases of data publishing. And at the very bottom, there's a couple of links to some XML tutorials that are really useful if you want to learn more about some of the features of XML. Do you want to talk about details of data tables, or should we just open it up to questions? Questions for Kristin, too.
Margaret, this is Kristin. I'd like to see what you have to say about the attribute level metadata.
About attribute level metadata. Okay. So to get into the details of attribute level metadata, so basically this is the template again, and there is a, I didn't go into detail because of the ways that the different parts map to the EML, because it's actually a little more complex than fits in a single slide. So so basically the main feature of a data table is that you are describing the attributes of that table. In general terms, the word attribute defines a property of an object, say an element or even a file. In database vocabulary, this is what you would use to call it, if you call a table column, is called an attribute. If the data are arranged in rows instead of in columns, then the row name could be called an attribute. So in ecology and environmental sciences, where data are usually arranged in tables or arrays, the attributes are often referred to as variables, parameters, columns, or field names. And a unit is a particular physical quantity defined and adopted by convention, and that other particular quantities of the same kind can be compared to. And in use and in laboratory conventions, there's often a blending or overlap between units and attributes. But on a structural level, and when you're creating an EML record, and in order for these to be unambiguously compared, the attribute and unit need to be distinguished. Units could be one of the most problematic categories of metadata to get a handle on. For example, there's many attributes that really have no unit, which is, it's pretty clear they have no unit, like named places or letter grades. But there's other attributes that where the unit is difficult to identify, despite maybe a suspicion that there should be one, and that could be like pH or dates or times. And then in other cases, a unit is very meaningful, but apparently it's absent because of dimensional analysis. It simply isn't there anymore. And this might be where you see something that's grams of carbon per grams of soil, and all they've given you is percent, and they may not even have told you that it was percent of grams. But anyone describing a data table needs to understand their own data, plus a moderate understanding of how to define the attributes and the units, and what's the relationship between these two. So attribute, whoops, I'm in the wrong place now. Attribute components. There are 5 components to an attribute description in EML. There's the attribute name is the first one. Basically, for these, we stress that the best thing to use for an attribute name in the EML record itself is the same name that you would use at the top of the CSV, for example, the name that you would give that column in a script. And so that means you probably want to limit yourself to alphanumeric and underscores, fairly simple characters. The attribute label and a description, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about. Those are longer and they're for display. So you can use whole words, capitals, character sets, as basically whatever you need to in order for a complete and unambiguous description for the data to be understood. Where it gets interesting is when we start talking about measurement scale. There are 5 measurement scale categories, 4 of which come from a system, a typology that we got from statistics. And so these, I have another slide that goes through these in a little bit more detail. So for now, I'm just going to read through them very quickly. They build on each other, where nominal is a relatively simple category or simple string variable. Ordinals are categories that are logical or ordered. Interval, now you've taken that ordinal category and made the magnitude between the steps known so that you have an equidistant interval between each of the points on your scale. And a ratio is an interval scale that now has a meaningful 0, which means that you can do math between values that are ratio scale. Those 4 came from a statistical typology, and then in EML we added date time because these are basically labels for points in time, because they are so important to ecological data. The 5th component is the unit, which only goes on the interval and measurement types. Here's a summary of those 5 types and the kinds of values you would find in each one. Again, so the nominals are members of a category. They're strings. They would be typed as strings, even if they're numbers. For example, in the example, there could be 1s and 2s, which mean male or female. Text comments would be nominal category. You can have coded values, and I'll talk about how the codes are structured in a minute. Ordinal, again, these are these nominal categories now that have a logical or ordered relationship. So academic grades is a good example, or something where you simply rank things high, medium, or low, where you don't necessarily have an amount that goes with those high, medium, or low. Interval scales are these now nominal categories, but where the magnitude is known. 2 common ones are Celsius and pH, where the actual there is no meaningful 0. And then ratio is an interval category that has a meaningful 0. So the difference between, say, a Celsius scale temperature and a ratio scale temperature, a Kelvin scale temperature, is that one's actually a ratio measurement, because the difference between 2 temperatures in Kelvin has physical meaning. Things like lengths, concentrations, organism densities all fall under ratio. And then date time has its own special meaning, mainly because it's got characteristics of both an ordinal and an interval types, in that can be parsed into, it's a scale that has really no meaningful zero, but if you know how the data is constructed, you can parse it into meaningful times. Coded values. Here's an example of coded values for the two string types, which are nominal and ordinal. Both of these, I think I've used, I used a place name for the first one. So this is simple categorical data. So I've got two kelp reefs here, one of them with a code and then the name of the reef. And then in the second one, which are the which are ordinal categories where they have an order relationship, I just have the code definitions of some academic grades. And both of these fit in if you look at the EML schema, you will see the description of code definition pairs. In R, these would be called factors, and R stores them in a particular way. So the code that we use to convert from data tables to EML makes use of that. What else have I got here? That might be the last slide I have. Yes, it's at the end. So, any specific questions about these? I think for me, the most interesting one is sometimes is this one or all the components of an EML attribute. And I said before, working with EML at this level is something that you might need some guidance with, and so that's where Colin and Kristin and I can help quite a bit.
Margaret, maybe you can unshare the screen now.
Sure.
If we can see if anybody.
Yeah, if I unshare the screen, then I'll get the whole.
Then you see everybody.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Or at least their names. Thank you very much, Kristin and Margaret, for the great talks. Very interesting. And does anybody have a question or several? Or comments? I would like to share their experience with EML and metadata.
I'm always happy to jump in there. One of the things about EML metadata is, and metadata in general, is it always seems like such a pain to pull all that information together. I mean, there's a ton of stuff. But the truth be told, if you're actually going to be writing R code to do something or analyzing it, you're going to need to know all of that stuff anyway. And you're going to need to type it in, and you're going to need to pull in all of the column names and all of those things. If you're going to be able to interpret the data at some future time, you're going to need to know what the units are. You're going to need to know what the missing value codes are. There's all the stuff you're going to need to know anyway. And the thing that is nice about this is that once you have it into EML, because it's in XML, XML is designed to be transformed into other forms. All of the web pages that Kristin were showing and Margaret was showing you of all the attribute data, all of the web display of that stuff, that was just taken right out of the XML document. Somebody had to give instructions about how it would appear, but the content was all there. So it makes it really reusable in lots and lots of different ways, some of which we've anticipated and some of which we haven't. But the good news is you don't ever have to type it in again. And you've locked it up so that it's going to be there with the data from there on. So that's one of the reasons that I think that that this is sort of the sort of thing that sometimes we miss when we're frustrated and we're trying to put all of this stuff in there, is that we only have to do it this once, and once we've done it this time, we'll never have to do it again. So anyway, that's one perspective on the metadata.
Thank you, John. Yeah. That makes them so useful, or providing them in EML. And along with that goes a question by Elizabeth. that she typed in the group chat window. She says, I've used FGDC in the past. What's the advantage of EML?
I'll jump in on that one. One of the things, FGDC is great for searching for data. It's great for maybe figuring out whether the data is usable or not, but it really doesn't help you out necessarily when you get into the nitty-gritty of actually analyzing the data. There's lots of FGDC metadata that leaves out things like what the units are or sort of the detailed attribute descriptions. I mean, there's a place in FGDC for it, but often it's not there, and that's a problem. The other thing also is that EML is much more sort of friendly to what you might call tabular data. It can handle spatial vector and spatial raster, and those sections of EML that handle spatial vector and spatial raster are simplified versions of the FGDC stuff. But it's not possible to just take a typical FGDC metadata and transform it into an R program or a MATLAB program. But you can do that with EML. It's that extra sort of level of detail on it. Now there are translators that will take EML and convert them into FGDC if you need to have that. There are some minor issues that sometimes need to be tweaked, but that's certainly something that's possible. And we've also done some work with actually taking the metadata that's stored inside some of the Esri map layers and things like that and converting it into sort of stubs that contain sort of part of the EML, part of the things you need to store in EML that can be read directly from the ArcGIS metadata. So there's these are not unrelated things, but EML, because it tends to be so nitpicky, so detail oriented, it's much easier to go from EML to something else than it is to go from something else to EML. I mean, EML's already separated out first and last names so that you don't ever need to worry about, well, I got a name, which is the first and which is the last, that sort of thing, which turns out to actually be a much harder problem than you might think if you've ever dealt with anybody from Brazil where they have about 8 names.
Well, and even, yeah, it's generic enough that you can put, say, Asian names in family name in a different order. You can present them however you need to present them. If you can, and language is supported on many of the elements. Yeah, I think in general, EML is more granular than FGDC, although some of the high-level elements have the same name because FGDC was around already, but the goal was to improve upon it for certain kinds of tables and actually have a schema that can control the content to some extent by additional typing and the measurement typology.
Do you know if the new EML version accommodates raster data a little bit more or in more detail?
My understanding is that's not going to, that 2.2 that they're working on right now. I'm pretty sure they're not addressing 2.2 right now. The main features are, raster data in 2.2. The main features are annotation and additional like project descriptive elements.
Okay.
So that they, for some specific projects, have requested that kind of work. There are other good schemas for spatial data already. So I think some people are, ambivalent about EML actually trying to duplicate any of that effort at all.
Stephen commented on your answer saying Markdown and Markdown, I assume.
Yes, that's what he's happiest about. There's a lot of some text elements in EML that use an older spec called DocBook. I guess it's not that old, but they're actually adding Markdown support. So it'd be an alternative to having DocBook. for text elements.
Margaret, I think I might have misunderstood something in your description, with the off the deep end section of your talk. So I just wanted to clarify. It was in distinguishing the terminology maybe between what I'll think you said, or what I call data types. When I say data types, I'm referring specifically to integer, double, that level of how the computer's storing it, versus this classification. I don't know what your overarching name for interval, ordinal, nominal, etc. is, because in my mind, a nominal variable could be stored either as a string or as an integer or something else. It's not necessarily, those two don't map to each other. So what's the name for?
Right. I'm not sure the name for this typology. I just recall that it came from statistics, and I remember seeing a reference for it, which I think is in the EML BP doc, the one that there's a PDF at the end of one of those links. And it's from the 40s. It's pretty old.
But they're not equated in EML.
No. And EML also has an element called storage type, which we've actually had a lot of conversations about. Should storage type override a nominal, say if you have a nominal type and a storage type, and if a nominal type is typically a string, but you have a storage type of say integer, when should that storage type override the typology, this other typology, which is it's an alternative in a sense. And I believe I have to go back and look. So and this is where we use the data manager library for some of these, because it actually is taking that data entity and reading it into Postgres, and that's where something like a storage type is more likely to apply, is for the system that's reading it. So in that case, we've decided, because storage type was an option, and this typology of measurement scale is not, that if a constructor went to the effort to put in a storage type, that we should accept that first, as far as how it would be stored in something like Postgres. And then if there was no storage type, you could use the measurement type to infer what a storage type could be. I think what there else is besides.
There's another question from Riley. Is it acceptable, appropriate to create a metadata document for a dataset? You find that in the chat window. That is not your own, assuming you have sufficient information. I'm wondering if there is an accepted etiquette in the scientific community. I work on a project that uses data from a variety of sources, some of which do not yet have their own EML metadata documentation.
Yeah, that's a great discussion. I actually work with another project that's doing exactly that, and we had to sit down with. That's more about policy and how you implement a policy for data sharing in a relatively large group. And the answer is yes, we do it. But what we've discovered is that you really have to let people know that that's what you would like to do and get their permission. And then we also need to respect that their ownership wishes. That, if we take, just because I took a data set and worked it up into EML, my name is not on that data set. I could be a metadata constructor, but the creator would be limited to the people who put the intellectual merit on that data, not me, not the person who just constructed a data set. And not everyone agrees with that. I've seen data sets scraped off of one site and another person's name tacked on the end who did nothing but scrape it. And I disagree with that practice, but there's nothing I can do about it. But that's actually a really good conversation that some of the repositories are having, because they're trying to add value to some of the data they're inheriting. And in some cases, the original scientist is around. And even if they are, though, they may not be interested in actually adding value to their own data. So then someone else has to try to interpret it and add some material. But still, who owns it is a good question.
Then also from the chat window, just very briefly, because my question might have introduced confusion. So John points out that EML does support spatial data types. So because I think, Margaret, you said not as comprehensive, or maybe John said that, not in with as much detail as for tabular data. So, but is that you know, our previous discussion
about FGDC?
Yeah. So EML does support spatial data types. So I just wanted to clarify this because I might have introduced confusion with my question if the new version accommodates.
I see.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does XML support the notion of importing namespaces? I mean, does EML in any way import ISO for geospatial data types, or is that impossible?
It hasn't done it yet. Actually, if you follow the thread having to do, the only one that we're importing right now is an older unit, the way of describing units called STMML, and the people that wrote it have pretty much abandoned it in favor of, I think, CML for chemistry. They're chemists. The best place, if there was a namespace you particularly wanted to be able to use, there's what they call the additional metadata section, where it can hold any XML you need to. We need to use that with care, though, because then it all depends on the practice that's evolved to use that particular metadata, whatever it is you put there, which could be an entire another namespace or some other kind of annotation.
Okay, one last question from me, and then I'll shut up.
No, this is fine.
Maybe this is more a question for Kristin, actually. Where do I go to find controlled vocabularies? Is there a registry of controlled vocabularies? I feel like this is who's watching the watchers kind of question, but.
That's a good question. I'm not aware of a registry. There are a couple. I would say just Google it, honestly. There are some in Europe that seem to me they should have more applications here. There's one called MThes, which takes the LTER vocabulary, which is 960 terms, and has expanded on that. And so it seems like a really good option. There's also the Global Change Master Directory, which has categories of controlled vocabularies, and I find that one most useful when I get some socio-ecological data, because they have a category for human dimensions. So does anyone else know about a registry? I'm not aware of one.
So I've heard ESIP is trying to develop some sort of a semantic registry that could hold thesauruses, ontologies, all kinds of things. I'm not sure what kind of progress they're making on that. And I just got an email today that Suite is out. There's a new Suite out, which is another control.
Yeah, a lot of the challenges on that is sort of figuring out exactly what you want to do with it, because it's entirely possible to come up with controlled vocabularies that have so many terms that no term will ever be used twice, and no data set will, in other words, basically you can get so micro-focused that it's not very useful in terms of doing searching. At the same time, also, you can have ones that are too coarse, of where you're lumping things together that maybe people would like to discriminate. And it's a tricky issue, as to just, do you want to have 10 million terms? I mean, in principle, we've got, the dictionary, that's a controlled vocabulary, but you sure as heck don't want to use that for coding documents, because there are too many alternative ways to code the same concept. You'd like to sort of force people's hands a little bit in terms of making it so that they use some general terms and things like that. But then again, if you get into ontologies that actually talk about the relationships between terms, well, then maybe it doesn't matter whether you use tomato or tomato. It's going to know that tomato is the same as tomato, and full speed ahead.
Well, the problem you end up with then is is my concept of a tomato the same as yours?
Right. Yeah. As you will find out with metadata, as in all other things, there are always going to be areas of fascinating discussion, preferably over beer.
So Ian, I found the link to the head of the data. It's called the Data Manager Library, the database loader for EML. I just put it in the chat window. It's part of the Git clone, if you clone the whole thing.
Are there any more questions?
Oh, there's another question from Jeff Sanders. If your organization needs to document both spatial and tabular data in detail, perhaps two standards are necessary, EML and ISO.
Yeah, that was when I tried to clarify that EML does support spatial data types. Because that
okay.
Dialogue going on between John and Jeff. Yeah.
Yeah, some of us have been talking about that for I have some files for the SBCLTER that are NetCDF, and they're essentially self-describing. So I'm thinking, what should I really be picking these apart and putting them into something else? Either when I can just leave it as it is. So that's that's a good discussion too. I'm not sure when I should do that and when I can just leave it as a NetCDF file.
Write a NetCDF parser. Come on.
Yep.
Right.
One of the things that's sort of the approach we took on our data for spatial metadata, was that what we did was we wanted to have the metadata in the Esri format, so it's inherently part of the file. But the problem is that if somebody wants to search for that data, well, that's not accessible and so forth. So what we did was just basically wrote some style sheets that essentially take the Esri metadata and extract the things that we need and paste them into to where we want them in EML. And then of course we have to add other things around the sides because their metadata isn't as complete. But that's not sort of an unreasonable approach to take. The thing that is the bane of your existence is unstructured metadata under those circumstances. If somebody gives you a Word file, then it's up to you to go through and cut and paste stuff out of it. You can't write a program to go in and do it for you automatically. And that's what you'd like to have, is automate as much as possible. Didn't mean to kill the conversation.
You did, John. It's actually after the hour.
It's already going on to next time.
Maybe people are just hungry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, for the comments. Okay, maybe with this we conclude this webinar, because we could probably talk for a long time about all these things. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks, Kristin and Margaret. Goodbye.